let me ask you something. Are prisons obsolete? Read this book and find out. But the answer is yes. At least according to Angela Davis, a political activist who has been political activizing since the 1960s. She is a Marxist, a radical feminist, and a former associate of the American Communist Party and the Black Panther Party. She has founded numerous nonprofit organizations over the years, including Critical Resistance, which is a prison abolition movement. She's written on numerous topics, including capitalism, sexism, racism, and obviously prisons in the United States. Are Prisons Obsolete is published in 2003, and it's probably her most notable book, and it's considered a staple in the prison abolitionist movement in America. It's a good introduction to the rotten institution that is the prison industrial complex, including its racial and gendered dimensions. The book is accessible, easy to read, and filled with good examples to illustrate Davis's talking points on how bad the current prison system is, particularly in the US, but of course her criticisms are applicable to other countries' penal systems as well. It reads mostly as a history and a current state of affairs synopsis of how things are in the States, with a lot of harrowing examples of just how brutally prisoners can sometimes be treated. A lot of the examples in this book will churn your stomach, and Davis never flinches from disturbing and graphic examples. I certainly agree that drastic changes are needed for the prison system, and this book will open the eyes of any reader who takes the prison system for granted or doesn't think about it too much. It's definitely an important read. This book is also notable for talking about the institutional racism of prisons, with Davis framing them as a tool to perpetuate white supremacy and maintain racial hierarchies in society. I found this racial component of the book really illuminating, and obviously an extremely important topic to talk about as Davis continues her fight for a post-racial society. When I went into reading this, I was of the opinion that root and branch reform was definitely needed, but I wasn't quite convinced that prisons were totally superfluous. But I wanted to be convinced. I wanted to believe that prisons were obsolete, that they should be abolished tomorrow, and unfortunately I found that Angela Davis's argumentation wasn't always the best. While this book is definitely important and more people should read it, while I agree that there are serious problems that require serious reform, I'm not quite convinced after reading it that prisons should be abolished tomorrow. I don't think we're there yet. And maybe I could change my mind eventually. Like, I'm not writing off the idea of abolishing prisons entirely. It's just that I need to be convinced. So let me give you an idea of why Davis's argumentation didn't quite do it for me. She begins the book by talking about, she laments that it's very hard to conceptualize a prison-free society. But she does very little herself to illustrate what a prison-free society would look like without falling into utopianism. She starts off by saying, oh, prisons were a humanitarian alternative to executions and capital punishment and all that stuff. But now it's time for a new alternative. And I'm with her so far, I'm going with what she's saying, and then when it comes time for her to provide us with alternatives to prison, she comes up very short. She's just like, well, if society was fixed, if all of these things about society were just not problems anymore, then there would be less crime and thus less need for prisons. But to me, that's putting the cart before the horse. The thing is, I agree with every one of her prescriptions for lowering the crime rate and improving society. For example, she says that drugs and sex work need to be legalized. She advocates for better mental health care, better education, and better social welfare, and allocating public funds to eradicate poverty. She talks about eradicating racism and bigotry in all spheres of public life. And these things are all great, and I agree that they would lower the crime rates, that they would lower incarceration. But I don't see how it makes prisons obsolete. And of course, the other thing is, a lot of the things that she mentions takes time and decades of sustained effort to implement. What do you do in the meantime? She doesn't really talk about that. Her thesis statement is basically, oh yeah, we won't need prisons once our society is a utopia, and that's far from satisfying for me. Another thing worth mentioning, it's one thing to tell people that non-violent criminals can be rehabilitated without the intervention of an institution, but everyone would pose the question, what about the violent criminals? What about rapists or murderers or serial killers or people who commit hate crimes? It's hard for me to see how people like that could be rehabilitated without the intervention of an institution. And Davis has an anecdote to assuage your fears, one anecdote about 4 men who were convicted of murder in South Africa. They used a mediator and they talked to the family, and there were apologies all around, and through the mediator they decided to basically exonerate these 4 people who had committed murder and let them go, basically. The anecdote that Davis mentioned turned out well, which is great. And I'm not denying that people who kill others can't be reformed, or they were just in a bad place at the wrong time, but to pretend that every murder fits that exact profile is really naive or misleading even. And I think that Davis leaves out important context about this particular case. She does mention that it's part of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or TRC, but she doesn't mention what bearing that has on the situation, or even what the TRC even was. I think the reason that she doesn't mention any of this context, or the special circumstances for why these men were pardoned, has to do with the fact that only 12% of the applicants actually got pardoned for their crimes. But then again, she doesn't really talk much at all about other post-prison solutions, like community-based justice that are practiced in indigenous communities all over the Americas, or other incarceration-free methods of justice. It just seems like kind of an auto mission. I mean, there are real-world examples of post-prison solutions being implemented, but she always either skates over it or doesn't bring them up at all. Davis also talks about the effects of capitalism on the prison industrial complex, and talks about how nefarious a profit-driven prison system can be. She says that the labor in prisons is basically another form of outsourced labor, and in some ways a continuation of slave labor in the US. The other thing that she mentions is that there is a trend away from educating and rehabilitating prisoners, with programs being cut and funding taken out of education programs within prisons, and how this is basically this cycle where the prisons have a profit motive for doing this, because less rehabilitation means a longer time that they have to exploit prison labor and make more profit from that labor, since the people who are laboring in prisons make almost no money and they're essentially forced to work. That's a really scary thing, and I think that that's an important aspect of this book as well. However, I think it's oversimplifying to insist that these types of problems only occur in capitalist countries. Convict leasing systems can readily be found in non-capitalist dictatorships, such as in North Korea and China, who have been caught numerous times leasing prison slave labor. Or take Soviet Union, for example. There were numerous instances where prison slave labor built entire towns, including the mining town of Norilsk. East Germany is another one. That one, they actually traded prisoners with the West to make up for shortfalls in their GDP. Even stranger is that Angela Davis actually met with the dictator of East Germany at one point during a state-sanctioned tour of the Soviet Union. That's pretty ironic, considering East Germany literally made itself into a prison. So yeah, Davis's bias is pretty clear, but I think that she is right on the money when it comes to showing that the increased privatization of prisons is inherently harmful, and whether under the guise of capitalism or communism, a profit motive will never be a good idea when it comes to something as sensitive as rehabilitating people who have committed crimes. Ultimately, prisons should be socialized and regulated so that the incarcerated people are not exploited for their labor or for making profits, and ultimately that's what Davis is getting at. She wants to move the model from making money or seeking revenge on criminals or whatever to actually helping people, to cutting down recidivism rates, and that's a stance that I am totally on board with. I think she does a great job at illustrating the importance of this shift. But while Angela Davis and I agree on the sickness, we kind of disagree on the cure. Like I said before, I'm more of the reform camp and she is the abolition camp. But there are times where she does acknowledge that prison can have a positive, transformative experience on the people that are in it. And with the right programs in place, it could be much better than it currently is. So let me read an example. She uses Malcolm X's time in prison, like his transformative period in prison, as an example of that. So let me read. Quote, "In the 1950s, Malcolm's prison education was a dramatic example of prisoners' ability to turn their incarceration into a transformative experience. With no means available of organizing his quest for knowledge, he proceeded to read the dictionary, copying each word in his own hand. Then, according to Malcolm, prisoners who demonstrated an unusual interest in reading were assumed to have embarked upon a journey of self-rehabilitation and were frequently allowed special privileges, such as checking out more than the maximum number of books. Even so, in order to pursue his self-education, Malcolm had to work against the prison regime. He often read on his cell floor long after lights out by the glow of the corridor light, taking care to return to bed each hour for the 2 minutes during which the guard marched past his cell." So this to me is a good example of how if the right motivations were in place, you could have systems in which prisoners could be rehabilitated and it would cut down on the recidivism rate. You would give them the motivations and the tools needed to make sure that they don't end up back in jail. But Davis uses examples like this to point out how there are no reformative resources in prisons and how that means that prisons should be abolished rather than reformed. But I don't really get it, because if you're able to envision situations in which people can be rehabilitated in prisons, surely the means are there to reform prisons in such a way that they're mutually beneficial for everyone. But it's weird that she doesn't, again, she doesn't mention recidivism rates at all, or the variables that cause them to fluctuate up and down. Like, in Norway, the place with the lowest recidivism rates in the world, they treat their prisoners with dignity, they give them the tools they need to grow and, make sure that they can fit back into society once they're out of prison. It's an approach that I think were the U.S. to adopt. You would see a lot of turnaround. You would see prisoners being treated with more dignity. You would see lower recidivism rates. And I kind of wish that she would talk about it, but I know that she doesn't want to seem like she's that much of a reformer. She wants to be a straight-line abolitionist, even though she accidentally sometimes makes more of a case for reform than she does for abolition. In terms of the titular title, "Are Prisons Obsolete?" her answer seems to be maybe they will be eventually, but she doesn't really do a very good job of definitively saying, yes, they're obsolete now, and this is why. So, despite the issues that I had with Are Prisons Obsolete, I don't want to give the impression that it's a bad book. Far from it, in fact, I would highly recommend it. It's a short, engaging, and very accessible introduction to the state of prisons in the United States, as well as the prison abolition movement. And the section on the history of the prison system in the States is worth it all by itself. While I still fall into the camp of radical prison reform as opposed to prison abolition, I still think the book is very valuable to read. Ultimately, I would give it a 6.5 out of 10. It may not have convinced me, but I really do need to engage more with this subject matter, and it made me exercise my own critical thinking in a subject matter that I don't think enough about, obviously. I do also intend on reading more about the prison system in the United States, as well as books that draw attention to the institutional racism in the system. For example, I have my eyes on this Pulitzer Prize-winning book about the Attica prison uprising. And who knows, after a little bit of reading and research, maybe I will be convinced by the prison abolition movement. But for now, that's my review, and I hope I gave you something to think about. If you have any thoughts on the book, or on the prison abolition movement in general, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. I've left a link to Critical Resistance, and in case you want to hear about prison abolition from them, or if you want to donate to their cause. And lastly, if you have any unwanted books lying around, consider donating them to prison. People who are incarcerated love to read, and as we've seen from the quote in the book, reading and self-education can be instrumental in rehabilitating yourself. So I would consider doing that, yeah. Donate your books. Anyway, next time I will be reviewing something completely different. It'll be a high fantasy novel set in the ancient world of Middle-earth, written by an author who is a linguist, and it's got a cult following. I'm sure you know which one I'm talking about. And that's all for now.